Okay, lovely. Hello, welcome to everyone. Thank you very much for joining this dial-in discussion in the middle of the day or the afternoon or early evening, depending on where you are. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of Open Democracy. I will start by making a few disclaimers, which is this is the first time that we've done a dial-in discussion like this. As most of the world is under some form of lockdown, we're all broadcasting from our own homes. There may be interruptions from animals, small children, other unprompted or unexpected visitors. So please bear with us. We really want this conversation to involve you. So if you have a question or comment for us, please click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, type into the chat window. I'll try and address as many of the questions as we possibly can. You'll find that your microphones are muted so that people can talk one at a time, but we'll unmute you if you want to make a contribution and you've got a question to ask or a point to make. We're really pleased to have you all here at Open Democracy. It's been a challenging time, as it has for so many of you, and we're trying all kinds of new things and thinking more about how we can hear and listen to each other more often, and the different ways we can do that, and we can stay connected even remotely. So thank you very much for coming. And I'm joined by two of my awesome colleagues and editors. Claire Provo, who's an awesome investigative journalist, founded our Tracking the Backlash project, which tracks global movements trying to push back against reproductive and sexual rights across the world. She's based in Italy, so she's had probably one of the longest experiences of this situation. And she used to work at the Center for Investigative Journalism and at The Guardian. I'm also joined by Adam Ramsey, who's our brilliant UK editor who used to work at People and Planet and has contributed to so many of our investigations, both in the UK and globally. And I'm going to start first because this conversation was prompted by a piece that Claire wrote, which has the quite provocative title, "Who's Happy About Coronavirus?" So I would just add that you can follow all the amazing work that Claire and their team are doing at Tracking the Backlash at opendemocracy.net/tracking the backlash. Claire, you've been tracking, you and many of your colleagues have been tracking anti-rights movements for years on Open Democracy and elsewhere. So tell me, why are they celebrating now, and what are they celebrating?
So yeah, thanks, Mary. And first, yes, absolutely, it's a provocative headline. You'd think, who would be happy at this moment? But when you think about it, borders have closed or are closing. There are more police on the streets. Our movements are restricted increasingly. In Italy, we need to show a form when we leave the house and be prepared to meet a police officer at any moment. Women are back at home where we belong. It's increasingly hard to access an abortion or even emergency contraception. Parliaments are suspended. Democratic debates are on pause. And far-right and authoritarian, anti-democratic, ultra-conservative movements, the movements we've been tracking for years, see things that they like here. It's not to say that they're happy with the whole situation, of course, but they definitely see aspects of this current reality that they like and play to their favor. And that's not just a rhetorical argument. It's more that one of the most striking things for me, sitting in quarantine in Italy under lockdown, is watching the social media and the newsletters and the communications of these movements that are saying this themselves. They're starting to adopt a very "I told you so" sort of attitude, where "I told you borders should have been closed," or making similar proclamations around women at the home, celebrating this in their own words. "This is how God intended it. Women are going to realize how important it is to be at home. The family is now the center of everything." And for these movements, it's also important to realize that the family means something very, very particular. It doesn't look like my family. It doesn't look like a lot of people's families. It looks like a family with a heterosexual married couple at the head, and their many, many children, and very, very strict gendered roles.
Thank you. Yes, that doesn't look quite like my family either. um, so I wanted to come a bit, because it's interesting. Your piece starts with Salvini celebrating closing borders, talks about how religious conservatives are celebrating the return of traditional values and norms, and also how they're celebrating the delay or postponement of crucial democratic debates. For example, the abortion bill that was going to be proposed in Argentina. And we've seen a massive power grab from authoritarian governments all across the world. I mean, Viktor Orban has made himself indefinitely the dictator of Hungary. And actually, that's something that on Open Democracy we've started to doing as well in response to this crisis. We've started this new thing with our colleagues at the investigative outlet Source Material called Democracy Watch, where we're simply just documenting each week all the powers that are being grabbed by governments and by corporations to surveil us, to put us under more surveillance, and to restrict our civic rights and freedoms. Of course, some of these unpleasant measures are arguably necessary, but many of them aren't. And critically, of course, it's about how long they're in place for. So we are just documenting what's happening all across the world and providing bulletins each week. It's called Democracy Watch. You can sign up to the newsletter, opendemocracy.net /Corona Crackdown. And we just hope that this is a contribution to, I guess, public and policy awareness that takes that global picture and is able to understand and track how repressive measures are being brought in around the world, and how authoritarian governments are often taking advantage of this in some pretty frightening and alarming ways. On that question, actually, Adam, you've written a couple of very viral pieces on Open Democracy recently. And the first one you wrote was, "There's nothing so political as a pandemic." Can you tell us a bit of what you mean by that? Because it kind of links to what I was just talking about there with the Democracy Watch.
Sure. So I suppose, I mean, it was slightly weird context that the pandemic arrived in for me, because I'd spent all of February traveling around Central Europe, kind of stopping people in the street in sort of cities in Eastern Hungary and Eastern Slovakia and in Ukraine and so on, asking how they felt about politics in their country. Because I'm very interested in this kind of way that the idea of politics has been changed from something we do together, how we kind of navigate, how we live together, to this thing we watch on telly that's far away from us, that's kind of alien from us, and it's, you know, at distance. And so I was just thinking about all that and that process, and using it, there's a term that social scientists use called reification, the way that politics have been reified, taken away from us and made into a thing, when the pandemic kind of struck. And I thought it was fascinating that a lot of the response to any criticism of governments was, oh, you're politicizing a crisis, don't politicize the crisis. When, you know, this is a massive collective action problem. A pandemic is about how we live together, how we behave together, what kind of responses governments do or don't take, who they prioritize, who they don't prioritize. These are all ultimately, you know, the most important questions of politics, questions ultimately which mean, you know, which decide who will live and who will die. And yet we're being told that even those decisions shouldn't be in the realm of politics. And so that tells you something, I think, very important about what we mean by politics and how we talk about it, and how we're taught that, you know, when people say politics, of course, that's another word for democracy. And so what we're being taught is that we shouldn't really have any kind of democratic say over any of the really important decisions that we make in society. And that's a process that's happened, I think, over the last 40 years, you might say, through neoliberalism. And I suppose the other thing that's really important for me is that, you know, as Naomi Klein has documented for a long time, crisis has always been used to kind of deliver massive social change, and particularly to roll out the most extreme forms of capitalism. And I think it's very interesting to watch at the moment, if you take the sort of Shoshana Zuboff case, that we're moving towards a kind of surveillance capitalism and away from neoliberalism, and think about how this crisis, I think, is quite likely to deliver that transition from neoliberalism to a, you know, kind of dangerous surveillance capitalism. We're already seeing that in some of the stuff we're monitoring around the world, and also, of course, can deliver some good stuff that we can also talk about too. So I think, you know, we have to understand this crisis is deeply political, and when people say, oh, you're politicizing the crisis, or, you know, this is all, you're just turning this to politics. That's a very dangerous attack on our democratic right to have a conversation about, you know, the kind of world we want to live in and who we do and don't prioritize.
You're based in the UK, and you also said that Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's currently has coronavirus himself, that he wants us to blame our neighbours for the crisis, and you've urged us not to do that. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So this is kind of, for me, part of that same process, that the way that governments often get away with kind of massive failures is they say, well, these aren't political problems about what decisions we've made. These are responsibility of individual citizens. So we saw this with climate change, that, you know, for a long time governments would say, oh yeah, well, we agree climate change is a massive problem, so you all need to go and change your light bulbs, at the same time as they were failing to invest in the kind of green infrastructure that we need. They would say, oh yeah, we think poverty in the global south, that's a problem, so you need to give to charities and buy fair trade, but they wouldn't deliver trade justice and kind of a fairer global economic system. We see the same with this, that they, you know, rather than accepting responsibility and investing in the infrastructure that we need, and in the UK there's huge scandal where they haven't given frontline workers protective equipment, they're not testing as many people as they need to, and they haven't given clear advice about, you know, whether we should be staying home and so on. And instead what they're sort of, you know, the way that they talk about it is very much shifting blame onto individuals. So there's all these stories in the press about, you know, people in London getting on the tube but maybe they don't need to, when in fact the government's been, you know, basically allowing bosses to tell workers they have to go in, even if their jobs aren't really key jobs. You know, the government has been, you know, Matt Hancock, the health secretary, told people they're being selfish for going out when, you know, in the park, when the day before Boris Johnson had been talking about how it's important to go to the park, for example. And so a key part of their communication strategy is to kind of get us all talking about how our neighbours are to blame. And there's been a kind of reports of a massive surge in the UK of people ringing up the police to say, oh, my neighbour's gone for his second run this day, you know, today. That's outrageous. And they're sort of turning people against each other, which is, I think, a very clear communication strategy that's about people not noticing how much the government has failed to manage this crisis well.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a very good piece by James Cusick that was published, I think, either earlier today or yesterday on opendemocracy.net as well, which I think Adam can put in the chat, which makes that point about the government's utter ill preparedness for this, even when the signs were quite clear. On your point about that and about the need for fairness and justice and equity at this time, we did actually, we're headquartered in London, so we started a UK-based campaign to the government to catch everyone in the safety net. The government's been here in this country, and this has happened in other places too, has kind of been picking and choosing who gets bailed out. And of course, the most vulnerable and marginalized people in our society are not seeing that, are not being caught by a safety net. So we've started a petition which has already had, I think, over 13,000 signatures demanding real living income for all. And you can see that on opendemocracy.net/Corona Safety Net. We've got lots of good URLs in this conversation. So we've had a pretty bleak conversation so far, but Claire, you also think there are reasons for hope, and there are opportunities, longer term opportunities. Can you tell us what those are, what your thinking is about that?
Well, just some of them, and this touches on some, I think, of things that Adam brought up as well. And also it relates to this conversation we're having right now. There is an appetite that is noticeable among my own networks, also among journalists and among people on social media for bigger conversations. Where I'm in Italy in particular, and we're, you know, many weeks down from a lockdown, a very reflective mood has set in on a lot of Italian social media. I don't want to say all of it, but you see a lot of big questions being asked, and maybe people changing their minds about some things. And there are some examples of, for instance, prominent anti-vaccine activists in Italy publicly appearing to repent and throwing their weight behind the quest for a coronavirus vaccine instead. That's really interesting. There's the possibility that anti-science movements might fracture, or that the ground under our feet might shift in some ways that I things that seemed like common sense before might no longer be common sense now, and there's going to be a fight over what that common sense is. And there's a lot of opportunity for that to be shifted in an extremely positive way for people who care about social justice, rights and equality. We're hearing more people talk about things like wage inequality, public health care, universal basic incomes, but also things like prison reform. There's a really, really important point here also, that while more people maybe are talking about these big questions, or they may seem to be talking about bigger questions, the reality is that this crisis is amplifying, but also it's revealing, but it's also amplifying these longer standing crises. I mean, things like the housing crisis was a crisis before coronavirus. Women's access to healthcare was a crisis before coronavirus. Misinformation targeting women around their health was a crisis before coronavirus. And coronavirus is, the current moment is bringing a lot of these long-standing crises to the fore and giving us an opportunity to maybe address them on a level that wasn't possible before. And there are some relatively small examples of really concrete steps in this direction. For example, we're seeing a lot of movement all of a sudden on misinformation online from social media platforms that 6 months ago seemed unwilling or just unable to tackle it, at least in any proactive way. The response was generally, show us what's bad and then we'll deal with it. Not, yes, we recognize there's a systemic problem here with misinformation online. And we're seeing momentum there, for example, with a number of tech fixes, but also with like the very, very simple response of let's fight misinformation with facts. And this is also like a difficult area because who controls what facts are is a tricky thing. But the fact that 6 months ago nothing seemed possible, and now people are springing into action, promising all sorts of things, means that, as we know, that where there is a will, there is a way. And these big conversations, the fact that longstanding crises are finally getting the attention they deserve, this does give me reasons for hope.
Thank you very much. Adam, would you add anything to that actually on the reasons for hope or optimism, or I think particularly actually the opportunities for making change happen in some concrete ways?
Sure. I mean, firstly, just, it's a point that's been widely made, but this is very much the end of neoliberalism, in the sense that once you've got past the political myth that there is no alternative to reducing state spending, to privatizing everything, etc., it's very hard to go back. And governments have shown over the last month that they can move and they can act in the economy. And we've seen this idea that wealth is created by individuals without any input from society, obviously has always been ridiculous, but once you see massive social change, that becomes more obvious, and so on. So absolutely, I think that the shift in kind of consciousness is enormous and disrupts a lot of the kind of very negative stories you've been told about the world. And I think the other thing that's hugely positive is the way that sort of mutual aid groups are setting up very rapidly across communities right across the world, and people are talking to their neighbours. I think that one of the ways that the ruling class has been very effective in stopping people from resisting to them, despite the fact that actually a lot of the kind of policies that have been imposed on the world over the last half century haven't been at all popular, is essentially by dividing people, keeping away from each other so people are afraid of their neighbours. And one of the things we're learning is actually that your neighbours are probably quite nice and you probably can rely on them. And they probably do think more progressive things than you believe them to. People right across Europe are always astonished to discover that their generally quite progressive views are the views of the majority of people across Europe, because a lot of the way that the media, particularly the more right-wing kind of billionaire media, has always operated is not by persuading you to believe that they're right, it's just by persuading you to believe that everyone else thinks they're right and that you're a minority. And so the fact that people are getting to know their neighbours again, which people have done less and less over the last 40 years as we moved around more, as we had more flexible housing, labour markets and so on, is a huge change, I think. And organising into these kind of solidaristic groups is going to transform the way people see their neighbours and therefore see the world enormously, I think. So that's, for me, the first opportunity. Begin where you are, and that means on your own street with your neighbours, with people around you.
Thank you. And one of the questions that was submitted ahead of this discussion, which is going to be really hard to answer because neither of us are international health or education policy experts, but someone asked, how can we develop international policies to develop an education that integrates health issues in a creative way? And there was one thing actually that you said a few weeks ago, Adam, about health being a public good, a public service, which I think is worth reflecting on here. I mean, we're not going to be able to fine tune policy proposals on this in this discussion, not least because we would defer to experts, I think there. But what's your insight when it comes to the opportunity for reframing the way we think about and provide for health?
I think that you don't have to go back very far in history to a point when infectious diseases were common enough that there was a widespread understanding that health is public, that we all live in herds, and even if you're pretty wealthy, you can't protect yourself from your staff if you've got servants or people around you getting sick and therefore infecting you. And so because of that, our health is fundamentally public, and it's not something you can kind of atomize into parcels individually and sell off. And I think that we kind of lost that idea partly because of the positive fact that we have got rid of a lot of infectious diseases through vaccines and so on. Public health programs had worked. And the result of that was people beginning in some bits of the world to think, well, this is a private matter for me and my family, that whether or not I get health insurance, particularly as we see in America. And, very rapidly, we've seen that myth destroyed. You can't have an atomized, privatized healthcare system once you understand that your health is dependent on the health of your neighbours. Yeah,
and of course that's particularly in countries like the United States, there's the potential for a real sea change. I mean, Bernie Sanders was pilloried by everyone further to the centre than him for an idea which we all just take for granted in lots of European countries, which is the idea that there should be free and public health provision. And I can see a real opportunity for the argument shifting on that one in lots of places. Another person asked, and we've touched on this a bit already, but it's fun to come back to, how best to use the new opportunities for bringing radical change center stage. And I wouldn't even necessarily say radical. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about here are very sensible and not at all radical. But I guess I wanted to ask you both, and I'll ask you first, Claire, what does a better world after this pandemic look like, and how do we get there?
So I think this is one of those really, really big questions, but one of the questions that's critical for everyone to sort of really pondering right now in this period. And I think on a really basic level, a better world after this pandemic, or a better world in general, looks like one where oriented around principles of rights and equality and collective action at its very core, where there is no backlash against women's and LGBT rights, and where there is no racial, social, and economic injustice. I mean, that's what the aim should be. And when the far right, ultra-conservative, authoritarian movements that we track, they think in terms of what they want the world to look like, not just next year or next week, but not just in 4 years, because they're not looking at elections. They're thinking about the next 20 years, the next 50 years. And is a core part of their strategy to have these very big conversations and visionary ideas. And so we want a world where there is no backlash against universal rights, where there is no racial and social and economic justice, as I said. And how do we get there is not something that can happen overnight. But it is something that has to start now. And this is also, these are there have been struggles on these issues for generations as well. And so that's really important to notice. And it's not a surprise that many of the groups that are starting mutual aid projects now amidst coronavirus are feminist networks that have existed for many, many years. And it's not a surprise that in Italy, some of the best reporting on state abuses under lockdown is being done by pirate radio stations that were set up decades ago in a different context. And so these struggles have been going on for a long time too. And so I don't want to say that we need to start now as if none of this has happened before. But what we do need is a sort of a sea change in our collective understanding that these questions cannot be put off, and they certainly cannot be put off until after the pandemic. We can't start thinking about how do we want things to look after the pandemic. We can't postpone these conversations for 6 months or a year or even a couple of months. We need to start these conversations now, and really critically, these conversations need to be inclusive spaces where voices who have long been excluded from media and public debates are included, and where we can also learn from the experience, for example, of feminists who have by necessity had to develop like brilliant organizing models and ways of addressing crises and providing mutual aid and support outside of state systems or outside of church systems, et cetera. And so these conversations have to start now. They have to be big. They have to be extremely inclusive, and we all need to be on watch on that regard about who speaks and whose voices are heard. And this is essential both in terms of the short-term response, the public health response, and WHO experts, for example, have explained that, like, very simply, like, you cannot beat coronavirus unless you leave no one behind. That it is one of these challenges that you cannot, like, the world cannot afford to only deal with coronavirus among the wealthy or among the already privileged. It just, that's not the way the response is going to work. So it's inclusion is crucial for this current public health response, but then it's all obviously crucial for the longer term response to threats to democracy and building a better world.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, I think your point about, and it's what you've underscored throughout this conversation, but the point about the fact that those who want to shut down our rights, take away our voices, put us back in our boxes or our homes or our kitchens, are already thinking long term and are already moving on this. And as your piece powerfully pointed out, they're already trying to use this opportunity to reshape and remake the world as they would like it. So the argument that, oh, well, once this is over, then we can work on things changing, just doesn't hold any water. Also, this has been pointed out quite a bit recently, but it's a very human reaction to trauma to want things to go back to exactly the way they were before. That's something that's been noticed in lots of different contexts at lots of different times. If you personally have a very traumatic experience, you get very sick, life-threatening illness, afterwards people tend to want to just go back to work and go back to the way things were, which is a very, very human reaction. And I think that it partly explains why more wasn't done after crisis moments like 2008. Although obviously there was an orchestrated effort to keep things the way they were as well from the powerful, as I'm sure Adam would point out. But I think we need to be conscious of that the window of opportunity for change is incredibly short, even though this pandemic is painfully and unacceptably long. And so being aware that the world is being remade faster and in this moment is really critical. Of course, you can look back at experiences in history where after big terrible things happen, big change does happen. So in Britain, after the war in 1945, that was the beginning of the welfare state, which was a game changer. There are plenty of examples of reactions to the Great Depression, which are both good and awful, including fascism. But the seeds for all those big changes are sown when those changes are actually happening. So bearing all that in mind, Adam, I wanted to ask you the same question really, which is, what does a better world look like after the pandemic, and how do we get there? And you've touched on some of this already, but some really, I guess, pragmatic steps as well as the vision would be great.
Sure. So I suppose that, one of the things that crises tend to do is expose the structures of power as they are, and let people know, in a sense, make their own judgment about whether they like those structures or not. And one of the things that we've seen, right across a lot of the world is that our economic system is clearly, not working, and also that actually the kind of political structures which we have in most of the Western world, which were largely modelled kind of around the 16th, 17th century, the 17th century, are also not really working. The kind of version of semi-representative democracy, which we all have, really isn't particularly delivering, and people don't like it at all in the kind of age of the internet and mass discussion. So for me, the answer to the question would be a much more democratic world. And how do you build a much more democratic world? Well, we need to think about those structures of power and how we'd like to replace them. I think that actually the kind of current crisis creates a lot of opportunity to have those conversations, which is a good place to start, and to build up institutions, because ultimately power changes because people organize through institutions. And so I suppose that's why I was talking before about mutual aid groups. We're seeing a lot more kind of trade union organizing in workplaces as people have realized that they're going to be forced to continue to go into dangerous workplaces unless they really do organize, for example. And I think that through building those institutions, and that includes media institutions, of course, and investing in media institutions, I should say, with Mary on the call, that we do change the world, because the power balance in society is in a sense a function of the different kinds of institution that we have. So I suppose that's what I'd say is, if we want to build a more democratic world, that means organizing people with less power through institutions, whether that's local community groups, whether that's global media platforms, whether that is trade unions, whether that's campaign groups and NGOs, and that because that's going to be necessary over the next 6 months, the next year, more so than it's ever been. It's always been necessary, but it's going to become, for a much larger portion of the world, it's going to become a question of life or death, whether or not we organize ourselves into institutions of social justice. Those institutions will gain enormous power. And then, the question is whether they can continue to survive after this crisis. And I think, we need to build them so they do.
Thank you so much. And there are a number of questions that people have asked, and I want to, and I also know some of the people or my colleagues know some of the people who've joined to participate. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to break a rule. First of all, I'm really sorry, Claire. I told you I wouldn't ask you any surprise questions, but someone's asked a really good one, which is, and we can talk this through together because we talk about this stuff all the time, but how can we combat the structural opposition to abortion care right now? That is opposition based on restrictions to elective procedures. You and I have been talking a lot about the way that access to abortion and contraception is being restricted or challenged by this crisis. You can talk specifically to the example in Italy, for example. And I wonder if you've thought at all about how those challenges can be overcome both now and what the opportunities are to change the system so that it's better in the long term. And I'll bring other people in on this as well, because I think there are other people on this call who've got good ideas on that front. I think we have.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about the situation in Italy because it's unique, but it's also revealing, and there are things in common between what's happening here and what's happening in other countries as well. So in Italy, and we have a story that we're publishing about this tomorrow morning. So definitely go to opendemocracy.net and it will be on the front page in the morning. Essentially, the situation in Italy is that abortion, including a medical abortion, hospitals are overwhelmed right now. And many appointments of any kind have been canceled, and the hospitals or postponed, and the hospitals are overwhelmed. The problem in Italy with access to abortion at the moment, which coronavirus is absolutely making worse, and the consequences of that are really extreme, in that carrying an unwanted pregnancy for any time is equivalent to torture, and carrying it long enough that you go past a limit where you can have a medical abortion and you have to have a surgical abortion means having a surgery you don't want. These are pretty extreme consequences. So the coronavirus is absolutely making things worse in Italy and making things harder because hospitals are overwhelmed. But the problem in Italy is that you have to go to a hospital to have a medical abortion. And that's not, it's in the Ministry of Health's guidelines, not in the sort of top level law per se. And this is what we're seeing in a lot of countries, is that the obstacles, like increased obstacles to sexual and reproductive health right now, I'm not saying entirely, but often are related to red tape around things like abortion care. And so also this red tape can vary between countries. So in Italy, it's the fact you have to go to a hospital. You can't go to a clinic. You can't go to a general practitioner. You have to go to a hospital and stay there for 3 days to have a medical abortion, to take 2 pills. Or you can, in some places, rarely, you can go home and then go back to take the next pill. But it's many hospital visits, a lot of time in the hospital, a lot of pressure on the hospital system. The problem in Italy is that bit of red tape. And there are calls, women's rights groups in Italy are increasingly mounting campaigns to have those regulations changed, which are relatively unique to Italy. Most European countries, this is not the case, that you have to go to a hospital. Italy also has only 7 weeks for medical abortion. Many European countries have 9 or more. So it's in Italy, it's that red tape, but other examples of red tape that exist in many countries that would also be having similar consequences, or could be, are things like mandatory counseling that you have to go to, or getting 2 doctors to sign something, or getting multiple doctors to sign multiple forms at different stages. And there are things that can be done about this. And I would say that, like in Italy, for example, there are campaigns to change the regulation, change the rules so that you no longer need to go to a hospital, that you could go to a different health center, or have access via telemedicine. But then there is also a second tier of action that is happening, which is women's rights groups that have been organized for years and years and years, are working overtime to help women find like the last remaining hospital in their region that offers abortion services. And so how would we help a situation like this in Italy would be the strategies that people in Italy have identified, not me, are get rid of the red tape, and get rid of the red tape now, but also, should that red tape have ever been there in the first place is the big question. And then the second strategy that they're using is to use networks that have existed for years to mobilize and do the best possible to help women navigate the challenges. Now, I'm not sure if that's completely in reference to what you were asking, but
no, it was very helpful, and it's quite a granular example of process and policy that gets caught up in this, and that can be changed, and that there's an argument for changing forever. It's not it's not only authoritarians who are shutting down our freedom of assembly and other things that the potential to change things and change things permanently can be positive and progressive too. I know that Nana from AWID is on this call, and I know that she has a great wealth of knowledge on how feminists more broadly are, how they organize. And I was just wondering if she wanted to speak at all to how feminist movements are organizing and responding to this crisis. She may no longer be here as well. So if she's not, then we can move on and we can talk about other things. But I wanted to give that call out. Julian, if you're able to unmute Nana, if she's here, that would be useful. Or indeed, if you connect with her, then we can bring her in a moment. Adam, did you want to say anything else on kind of practical granular examples of potential wins that whether they're political or policy that could be enacted now, and that that could actually be there for the longer term?
Well, I mean, in the UK, the obvious example is the benefit system that in the last decade has been transformed into a system designed to punish people for being unemployed, or for being not just unemployed, but for being in low-paid jobs. And as huge numbers of people suddenly rely on that benefit system, that social security system, and discover that, a system they thought was, lots of middle-class people frankly thought wasn't for people like them, suddenly discover that they do rely on it sometimes, and lots discovered that all at once. I think there's a huge opportunity in the UK, but also right across the world, to rapidly transform social security systems and remind ourselves that those are systems on which all of us rely at some points in our lives, or might well rely on some points in our lives, and they shouldn't be there to punish, they should be there to support.
Thank you so much. I just wanted, we're going to wrap this up in a moment, but I just wanted to give anyone else a chance to put their hand up. Oh, there you are, Nana. So Nana says, on my side, what I see are very much along the lines that Claire mentioned, queer activists in Kenya, for example, fundraising to support their communities. Did you want to say anything else about that, and share with us some inspiring examples, which we all are in need of at the moment, from Africa and from other parts of the world?
Thanks, Claire. I mean, I feel like part of the work that has to be done now is documenting some of these inspiring examples, right? Because it feels like there's so much. I don't feel like I can mention a list of them, but I really feel like the documentation of the stories are important. I think it shows how communities are stepping in where governments are failing. And yes, I think it's also an opportunity for us to use this to lobby for different ways of organizing, for a more of a bottom-up approach to organizing, and not always having this kind of top-down approach, because we can see that in moments like this, governments, even with the best of intentions, cannot react quickly enough to support people who are the most needy. I was thinking of an Instagram post I saw, for example, on my friend Timea Nadebeyi's Instagram handle, where there was a woman in a community in Lagos saying, well, the government has asked us to stay at home, but how can we stay at home when we have no food to eat? And she has taken it upon herself to literally go around the community, fundraise and distribute food packages to people in the community. You know, and I don't think this is how it should be. It's admirable, but it's not how it should be. And it clearly speaks to a failure and a lack of a safety net, especially for the most underprivileged. I think, like, for people like myself, it's fairly easy to stay at home. We have internet, we can work, we can go grocery shopping, but there are many communities who live from hand to mouth. Even just this morning when I went to buy fruits and vegetables, the woman I buy it from, she's there like practically in tears. She could not put out her entire food stand. She's scared the police will come and, you know, like basically destroy her goods if she does so. And she's showing me her bananas, which are rotten because nobody's buying it. And the goods were like 3 times the cost of what they were last week, because how does somebody like that self-isolate, even in the best of intentions, right? It may seem like the most sensible thing to do, but for some people, it literally means death and starvation.
There's also, I don't think there's been enough global, public, visible discussion about what the implications are for this when it really hits countries with fragile health ecosystems, which broadly, there have been some exceptions. There are some countries with incredibly fragile health systems that have already been hit hard, but there are many more that haven't yet. And we've been covering that a lot on Open Democracy, and our colleague Kerry Cullinan has written about that recently, and Adam can share a link in the chat. But would love to hear your insights on that. I mean, one of the things that made me smile, Riley, was the quick and temporary inversion of migration power dynamics, where you had African countries closing their borders to Europeans and North Americans and telling them to go away, But that hasn't been a 100% successful strategy. So interested to hear insights as well about the potential impacts on those more fragile health systems and the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, from where I sit, you know, part of the reason why African countries haven't been able to invest in our health and social protection systems is also because of some of the structural adjustment programs we've gone through over the years, which basically did not allow us to do some of those kind of investments, as well as the millions and billions that are lost through illicit financial flows. You know, this is all money that we believe should be redirected towards the health and social protection systems. It's the reason why our systems are weak. And yes, clearly we live in a very interconnected world, and, you know, in Ghana, very, very early cases were all imported cases. But as far as I'm concerned, that's the nature of the world. It just shows how connected we are. So everybody, we are strong as the other country is strong. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of us here in the UK, again, smiled Riley at the whole Brexit situation in this context. It turns out we do live in a global and interconnected world, whether we like it or not, you know, referendum result or not. It turns out that we probably don't need to do as much business or leisure travel as we thought we might have needed to. It turns out that, I mean, this extraordinary, my colleague Laurie McFarlane wrote about how, you know, something like 50,000 people die a year in China from conditions related to air pollution. And so actually, even though COVID has had a devastating effect in China, the numbers, I think it's 3,000, 4,000, are dwarfed when you think about the numbers that are caused by air pollution deaths each year, and actually the numbers of lives that might be saved because of the decrease in pollution is absolutely staggering. So there's all kinds of very clear messages coming from this about the type of world we live in, and perhaps the type of consumption and travel and communication patterns that would better serve all of us. So yeah, thank you for that. I wanted to ask if anyone else wanted to come in at this point and just ask any more questions of the panelists, or to make any comments or suggestions about our coverage or anything really. Just put your hands up and we can unmute you if you'd like to contribute something. And there's some interesting comments going on. Jeremy, who recently left, talked about how, you know, the challenge we face once this crisis is over is a very tough one. You know, the West, governed by the likes of Trump, Johnson, Bolsonaro, working under the quote advice of the corporate and financial elite, will expect to return to the status quo, the world as it was before, a restoration of the norm. That means continued environmental pollution, ecological destruction, and above all, an economic system geared to individual enrichment rather than societal and planetary welfare. Changing the economic system means, amongst other things, recognizing there's no such thing as a purely private sector, that all enterprises are joint ventures with the state and with the people, which I think very much underlines a lot of the points we've been making here. So I think we'll wrap up there because no one else is urgently putting up their hand and begging to come off mute. You can look at all our coronavirus coverage at opendemocracy.net/coronavirus. I would urge you in particular to follow the work of Tracking the Backlash. We put the link in about that earlier, the work that Claire has been leading. The best way of staying up to date with everything that's going on is our newsletter. And again, you can get that Open Democracy at opendemocracy.net. I do think that perhaps one of the most important lessons that coming out of this is that there is a value in having reliable public interest and public service journalism, that we need accurate, reliable, trustworthy information. And we do need to hear from a wide diversity of voices and perspectives. And so that's the work that we're doing, and I'm very honored to be doing with my colleagues at Open Democracy. Obviously, if you want to support our work in any way, then that would be wonderful and marvelous, and we'd be very grateful, because we don't rely on advertising, which is a very good thing at the moment. We don't have any dark money sponsors or billionaire proprietors. So if you wanted to contribute, it really does make a difference, and you can do that at support.opendemocracy.net. But most of all, I just wanted to thank you all for participating and listening in, and hope that you all stay safe and healthy and well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.